Hey guys, I recently posted a GIF of a game I'm currently working on, and a lot of people asked me how I did the dialogue, so this video is kind of going to give you a walkthrough of what I did. Alright, so to start, we're just going to go ahead and create a new sprite, and I'm just going to name this SPR underscore player, and we're going to go ahead and set this to 32 pixels by 32 pixels. Now I'm going to be working in GameMaker Studio 2, so if you're used to version 1, this is going to be a little bit different, but I've been using this for a while now, and I really like it, and it's the future, so it's what I'm going to be working with in this case. Once we have our sprite for our player, we're just going to go ahead and make an object for it. So I'm going to create a new object, call this obj underscore player, and we're going to go ahead and give it the sprite that we just made, and just go ahead and just put that right into a room. So I'm going to drag my settings over to the right hand side here so I can quickly access my resource tree so I can drag it into the room here. And I'm going to go ahead and set up the room. There's a few things that I'm going to change as far as the settings. I need to enable the viewports. I need to turn on viewport 0 to visible. And I'm just going to go ahead and give it some dimensions. I'm going to be setting my viewport to 480 by 270. And I'm going to set my Alright, and I'm going to set my viewport to 960 by 540. Alright, tell it to follow the object player, and then I'm just going to set the border to 240 by 135, just so that the object more or less stays in the center of the screen. And I think that should be good. So let's just go ahead and run this just to make sure we got the settings right. And we should see, yep, there is our player object in the middle of the window. All right. So moving back over to our player object. All right, we're going to go ahead and add a create event. And then I'm just going to put in a description here to initialize the player object. All right. Now I'm just going to go ahead and write some code here. You don't have to enter any of this because I'm going to be deleting it all in a bit, but I'm just going to explain kind of my thoughts on this and what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to put in a variable called dialog and set equal to hello world. So we're going to have this string here. And then I'm going to just write this out to the screen by using show message and set that equal to dialog. All right, so when I run this game, this is going to take the words hello world and output them to the screen. All right, perfect. So if I want to put a lot more things into dialog, which I'm going to need to do, I'm going to have to use something called an array. Now, you've probably already seen arrays. A few of them would be alarm and argument. And you may have used like alarm 0 or 1 or whatever, but you might have also seen it done this way with a number in a bracket. And this is an array. So I can reference, alarm 3 or argument 2, so on and so forth. But we can also do the same thing with our own variables. So I can set dialog 0 equal to hello world and dialog 1 equal to how are you. And when I do this, if I run this now, you'll see the dialog now actually has both phrases in it and kind of a bunch of curly brackets. And if we add the brackets back down here, we can ask it to just show one of these messages. So there you see I am asking for message 0. All right, so let's go ahead and delete this. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to create something called dialog part and part 0. And I'm going to set this equal to just hello world again. Now what I'm going to be doing here is we need to store a lot more information for each line of dialogue than just the dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and create dialogue part 1 and set that to, let's just say this is going to represent whether or not we continue to the next line. So let's just set this to true. We'll have another one, dialogue part 2, and set that equal to, I guess, the picture that's going to be displayed. So we'll just use our sprite player. And then we're going to put in one last one here. So dialog part 3. All right, now what this is going to be used for is this is going to be used to basically indicate whether or not our picture should be on the left side of the dialog box or the right side of the dialog box. So we're just going to use another true and false here. So all of this together is going to represent one line of dialogue. So we're just going to actually add a comment, parts of a line of dialogue. All right. And then, actually, let's just go ahead and just set our variable up here. So we're going to say dialogue equals, and then we're just going to put two brackets here, and that's just going to basically say we're creating an empty array. And then down here, we're going to set dialogue 0 equal to dialogue part. So all four of those things are going to get dumped into our first line of dialogue. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and just copy this, just so we'll have two lines of dialogue, and set this back to how are you, and then just since this is an example, we'll just set this to false because we don't want to continue. Set this dialogue 1, and now we're going to go ahead and run this, and now we're going to see all of our stuff, both of our lines, all of our little true false flags, everything is in that one string. All right. So if we want to get just one part of that message out, we're going to go ahead and create a new variable and call it message equals dialogue 0, and then set this to message. Now if we run it, we're just going to get one of these. All right. Now to get just the message or the string in there, we're going to set message equal to 0 as well, and that's going to get just the first item out of that array. So anyway, what I wanted to show you about that is that we can actually store a lot of things inside one variable, and starting with 0 and then counting forward, we can put in as many different things as we want into a single variable. And in our example, dialogue is holding a lot of lines of dialogue, and each line of dialogue is holding 4 different pieces. So to request the how are you message, we need to get our second line of dialogue, or dialogue 1, since it starts counting at 0. And then to get that message, we need to get the dialogue part 0, since that's the first line of data in that particular part. So we basically are storing an array inside an array. Now, if that didn't make sense, that's not a big deal. I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of what I was doing. All right, so that being said, let's actually start making our real dialogue system. So we can go ahead and start by deleting all of this stuff in here. And then I guess we'll put back the dialogue equals our two brackets to start with an empty array. And then we're going to go ahead and create a new folder to put our scripts in for this. So we're going to say dialogue system. You can name this whatever you want. And then we're going to go ahead and create a new script. And this script is going to be used to basically automate that entire process of adding all of the different pieces of dialogue to all of our different dialogue lines. So we're just going to go ahead and call this add dialogue. And then over here, we're just going to give it a description. Add lines of dialogue to the dialogue array. All right. So at this point, we're going to create something called parameters. Now this might be new to you, but it's basically just a fancy comment that will show up when you type in a function. So we're going to say at param dialogue, at param continue, at param avatar, and then at param this is going to be the one for whether or not they should face left or right. So I guess we'll just call it left facing. Basically what we're doing is we're just naming the different arguments for our function, so that later on down the road, when we go to actually use this function, GameMaker will actually tell us these 4 things so that we can just remember what we need to put in. So we're going to start by creating a new variable, var dialogue part equals empty array. And we're going to go ahead and set dialogue part 0 equal, and then we're just going to copy this because we know you're going to need 4 of these. Then set this to 1, 2, and 3. Now at this point, you might be expecting us to write in like argument 0 and argument 1, but we're actually not going to do this because what we want to do is be able to set defaults, and that way, if we don't fill in all of the arguments for our function, GameMaker will automatically fill in those parts for us. So let's start by writing var dialog text equals just double quotes for an empty string, var dialog continue. We'll set that to probably false, and then var dialog underscore avatar equals, let's put double quotes again, and then var dialog underscore left facing, and we'll set that equal to true. All right, so now we're just going to go ahead and put those variables we created down here. So we're going to put in dialog text, and I'm just going to go ahead and add some comments. You don't necessarily have to do this, but let's see, dialog continue. I just find it's a good idea sometimes to add comments, just so that if you go back and look at your code later on down the road, you can kind of see what you were doing and what you were thinking at the time, and it can save you trouble in the future. All right, dialog avatar. And finally, dialog left facing. So if we were to run this right now, obviously all we're going to get is our default values. So we're actually going to have to allow the script to take those arguments and replace our defaults. But first, we're going to go ahead and set dialog equal to dialog part. All right, so let's go ahead and allow us to add those overrides right now. So we're going to say if argument count is greater than or equal to 1, then dialog part equals argument 0. All right, now this is important. It has to be in brackets. If you just write in argument 0, GameMaker will throw an error because if it's not provided. All right, so if argument count is greater than or equal to 2, so in other words, if we have more than one argument that we passed in, do this. So dialog continue equals argument 1. All right, if argument count is greater than or equal to 3, then dialog avatar equals argument 2. And finally, if argument count is greater than or equal to 4, then dialog left facing equals argument 3. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and write some comments in here. But while I do that, essentially what I'm doing here is exactly what I did when I was kind of first walking you through the code. I'm basically going ahead and creating 4 parts of dialogue. The text that I'm going to display, whether it should continue or not to the next line of dialogue, what the picture is that it should display, and whether the picture should be on the left or the right hand side. And I'm taking all 4 of those parts and then I'm saving them to the dialogue variable. And the dialogue variable is going to be this one up here that's stored in our player object. Now the reason that it's able to use dialogue is because we're going to be calling our add dialogue function right below it, and that's going to be the same as if all of that code was right here. Having it in a script just allows us to keep reusing it. Okay, so add dialogue, and we're just going to use just the first parameter. We're not going to put in all of it. You can see our little parameter showing up there at the bottom. So hello world. All right, and then that will put in hello world, and then everything else will be defaults. So show message, dialogue. All right, so we run this, and we should see all of the different parts of... Okay, so apparently I messed up somewhere in there. We are not seeing the hello world text. So we're gonna have to scroll back down to our add dialog function and see. Okay, so there it is. So I wrote dialog part. That should have been dialog text. All right, so let's just go ahead and run that one more time. And there we go. We can now see everything is as it should be. All right, so as you can see, that's a whole lot easier already to add lines of dialogue than it was without it. So we're just going to copy this and write, how are you? All right, now we see an issue here. The first line of dialogue went away, and that's because we are overwriting our dialogue each time. So we're going to go ahead and create a new variable called dialog line, and we're just going to set that equal to 0. And now we're going to come back down to our add dialog, and we're going to say dialog, and then we're going to put that variable into those brackets. So this way we're telling it that we want to write to dialog line 0. So to write to other lines of dialogue, we're now going to have to increment dialog line each time. So we're going to say dialog line plus equals 1. And so that means every time we run this script, dialog line is going to increment by 1. So the next time the script calls it, it's going to be writing to a new line. All right, and as you can see, both of those messages are now in place. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create another object, and we're going to call this object dialog controller. All right, we're going to add a create event. And in the description, we're just going to say initialize the dialog. All right, so this is the object that's actually going to draw our dialog box to the screen. So to do that, we're going to be making use of GameMaker's built-in GUI layer, or GUI layer. And to do this, we're going to need to make sure that the GUI is set to the same size as our room view, or otherwise this is going to look really small. So set the GUI resolution. All right, so display, set GUI size. And now, actually, I suppose I should mention at this point that if you're used to GameMaker Studio One, you're going to be used to using things like view underscore X view, view underscore Y view, W view, you know, all these different things like that. But this actually changes in GameMaker Studio 2. So the function we're going to use instead is camera get view width, and then we're going to pass in view camera 0. Like that. All right, and then for the height, we're going to get camera get view height, and then again we're going to pass in view camera 0. All right, so this is going to set our GUI resolution to be the exact same as the view that we defined in our room. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a new script. We're going to call this start dialog, and this script is, when it runs, is going to create that dialog controller. So parameters that we are going to give this are going to be the object that we are storing our dialogue in, and then the dialog line that we want to start at. All right. So since we're going to be creating that object, the first thing we need to do is see if it exists in a room. So if not instance exists object underscore dialog controller. All right. Now this is another function that GameMaker has changed in GameMaker 2. Depth is handled a little bit differently. You no longer set it in the objects, you set it programmatically. So instance create depth, that's the new function. So we're going to go ahead and set our X, Y, and now our depth. So just 0, 0, 0, and then object dialog controller. All right, so just something to be aware of. All right, so object dialog controller dot dialog lines equals argument 0 dot dialog underscore lines. Object dialog controller dot dialog line equals argument 1, and then object dialog controller dot fetch equals let's just set this to true. So what does this do? Well, argument 0 is going to be the object that is storing our dialogue, and argument 1 is going to be the line of dialogue we want to retrieve. And in GameMaker, if you reference an object and then put a period and then a variable name, you can look up a variable or set a variable in that particular object. So in this case, we're creating an instance of object dialog controller in the room, and then we're setting its dialog lines variable to be equal to the dialog lines variable of whatever object argument 0 represents. And then we're setting dialog lines in our dialog controller equal to whatever the value of argument 1 is. And then finally, we're setting a variable of fetch equal to true. And fetch is going to be used to tell us when to look for new lines. And that will make a little bit more sense in a bit as we start to write this next function. So create a new script and give it a description, get dialog pieces from object. Okay. Now this is only going to have one parameter, and that's going to be start line. So we're going to write if fetch, and that's basically going to see if it's true by default. So we'll say if fetch dialog output equals an empty string, and dialog output speed is equal to 0. All right, so basically we're just going to set up some defaults here. So variable dialog data equals dialog lines, and we're going to pass in dialog line, and then we're going to say dialog text is going to be equal to dialog 0. Actually, I'm going to say dialog data 0. All right. Actually, you know what? Let's just copy and paste this from up here, because essentially we're just going to be taking the same thing as here. So let's just grab these lines and just paste them down here. Although I'm not sure if this will actually save us any time, but all right. So let's clean this up, get rid of these variables here. Maybe we don't need that either. We'll just get rid of these if statements. It probably didn't save us any time at all, but dialog data 0, dialog data 1, dialog data 2, and dialog data 3. And then fetch is going to be equal to false now. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is the very first time this runs, fetch is going to be equal to true, and we want to set up a bunch of defaults. So the output is going to be the actual message that we're going to write on the screen, and since we're going to have a sort of typewriter effect, where we're going to be writing one character at a time to the screen, we're going to start off with it set to nothing, and then the speed, there's a function that's going to split the string and write it for us, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for right now we're going to start with that 0. The dialog data variable is equal to those two variables that we set up in the start dialog script. If you remember, we had two arguments that we passed to it. The first one was the object that contained all of the lines of dialogue, and in this case, object player. And then the second one was which line of dialogue we should start with. So basically dialog data just takes that information and gets the correct line of dialogue from everything that it was given. And then the rest of it just kind of splits all of that up. So we actually have variables to work with instead of just numbers. All right. else dialog output equals string copy dialog text 1 dialog output speed, and then dialog output speed plus equals 0.8. Now we're going to go back to our controller object and add a step event, and basically we're just going to use this to get our dialog lines. So we're going to call our new function get dialog, and we're going to go ahead and create a new sprite. We're going to call this SPR dialog box. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set the dimensions of this to 192 by 64, and then we're just going to go ahead and give this kind of a semi-transparent dark background. But I mean, obviously you can draw this to look like whatever you want, and we'll just kind of put some something of a border around it. If you're following along with this tutorial, I'd recommend using those sizes, because in a bit when we work with the positioning, you won't have to worry about figuring out the math for how anything will be positioned. But feel free to tweak this as much as you want afterwards. So we'll go ahead and create another one for the portrait. So we're going to call this SPR portrait box. And then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing here. Now I think what I might do is I think I actually want these to overlap a bit. So I'm actually going to go ahead and resize this and just kind of give me another pixel to work with here. So set the width to 65. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just kind of draw this so that I can overlay it on top of the dialog box, and it will just kind of seamlessly all blend in, and it'll look like just kind of one solid image. But to do that, since this is going to be able to be positioned to the right or the left, I'm going to need to turn this into an animation so that I can actually have the first frame be for being on the right side of the box, and the second frame be for on the left side of the box. So I'm going to finish drawing this here. Again, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but this should look pretty good. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And we're just going to go ahead and flip or mirror this. Never mind. Flipping it would have done the other. All right. That looks good. Now that we've got both of those, we can go back to our controller, and we're going to create a new event, the draw GUI event. And let's give this a description. Draw the dialog box. Now we want to draw this if we actually have something to display. So if not fetch, and, we're going to need a font quick. So let's go ahead and actually add one now. We're just going to go ahead and just stick with Arial, call this fnt_dialog. And then we want to drop the font size down a bit, so we'll set that to 8. And then we want to turn off anti-aliasing mode, since this is a pixel game kind of interface we've been creating so far. It will just match it better. So draw set font, and set this equal to fnt_dialog. So we'll create a new private variable, x_offset equals 0 if dialog_avatar does not equal nothing, then if dialog left facing x offset equals -32. Else x offset equals 32. So what this is going to do is, if we have an avatar, then we're going to look to see if it's left facing. If it is, we're going to change our x offset to the left. Otherwise, we're going to push it to the right. So var x position equals camera underscore get underscore view underscore width view camera 0 divided by 2 minus 96 minus x offset. Var y position equals camera get view height view camera 0 minus 100. So what this is going to do is we are going to be taking our camera view width and dividing it by 2 to get the center of the x-axis of the screen. And then we're going to be subtracting 94 from it to get our, to kind of center our dialog box. And then we're going to be subtracting or potentially adding to that based on what the value of x offset is, so that we can push that left or right depending on whether or not we have an avatar image. If we don't have an avatar image, then that box will stay in the center of the screen. So the kind of nice thing about this is it will be centered if there's no avatar image. If there is, it'll push it to the left or the right accordingly. Which is why I wanted to make the portrait box image its own standalone image and not part of the main one. Next, draw set each align. We're going to set this to FA underscore left. So that stands for font align left. And basically, if we've changed the font alignment at all, this just verifies that it's set back to left so we don't end up drawing our text in some weird way. So draw sprite, and then we're going to grab our dialog box, set that to 0, and to our X position, and our Y position. And I see GameMaker still complaining. Oh, I'm missing a parenthesis up there. Yeah, that should be the camera width divided by 2. Draw text ext X position plus 10, Y position plus 6. We're just basically pushing it off of the edge so it doesn't overlap that border we made. String hash to new line. Dialog output. And 16 and 175. And oh, missing a parenthesis there. Okay. So what that'll do is that'll actually draw whatever text we have in our dialog output at that particular time to the screen, and make sure it stays within the kind of box that we want it to be in. Okay, now that's done, let's start working on our avatar. And let's just actually test this quick. So okay, we still got that, and we have an error. Okay, so I'm gonna go look at the start dialog. You know, I think this is named wrong. Okay, let's go to object controller. Yeah, we're using the variable dialog here. Sorry, so let's just rename that quick. So hop back to start dialog. We're just gonna name that, or just, yeah, chop off the end there. Okay, that should now work. Let's go ahead and test that again. Okay, we need to remove that box. All right, there we go. It output to the screen. All right, let's delete this. And we'll go ahead and put in true. Oh, we're going to need to create an image. So create new sprite, SPR underscore avatar. And we'll set this to 56 by 56 pixels, so it fits within that frame that we drew. All right, so now we're going to draw just a big smiley face. Perfect. All right, close out of all that. Okay. So now we'll put our avatar image here as our third parameter for our add dialog. So now if we go back to our controller, we can now add in the code to display this. So we'll say if dialog left facing. Now actually we should probably check and make sure that we actually have a dialog first, or an avatar first. So we'll say if dialog avatar does not equal nothing. Close that off. Okay, so draw sprite SPR portrait box, and we want to use the first frame of that, and X position minus 61, and then Y position, draw sprite dialog avatar 0 X position minus 56, Y position plus 4. Okay. So now, if it's not left facing, we want to put this on the right side. So draw sprite SPR portrait box 0 X position plus 186, Y position, draw sprite ext, and we need to use this one so we can flip it. Dialog avatar 0 X position plus 248, Y position, and then the X scale is going to be -1 so that it's reversed, and then 1 0 and C underscore white and 1. All right, so let's just see what that looks like. Hello world. Perfect. Okay. So now let's set this to false and just make sure that it's flipping that as it should. And there you go. Now it not only has flipped our avatar, but it's also put it on the right side of that box. So let's go ahead and duplicate this avatar just so we can kind of show off the fact that we actually do have multiple avatars. And we'll just change the color on this. So we'll open up the image, pick a random color, and then fill that in. Okay, next step, we're going to go back to the player object and then put in false because we shouldn't continue beyond this point. We'll say sprite avatar 2, and see, this time we'll set this one to false and we'll set the first one to true, which since that's the default value, we'll just remove that. But our problem is at the moment, our script has no way to advance through the different lines of dialogue. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we'll go back to the controller and to the step, and we're going to now go ahead and add in the ability to basically press any key and continue through the dialogue. So var next equals false if keyboard check pressed vk underscore any key, then we're going to set next equal to true. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to pass in the next variable into our get dialog. So that way, in the step event, if we press a key, we'll pass it true, otherwise we'll pass it false. So now in our else statement here in our get dialog box, we're going to check that value to see if we should immediately advance to the next slide or immediately finish filling in our text. Okay, if argument, actually, let's see, if argument 0, and again, if you don't specify check, it just checks to see if it's true. If string, if string length of dialog text is greater than string length of our dialog output. And here we're basically just checking to see if we still have more to write out. If we do, then we're going to set the dialog output speed equal to 1000. And this is basically just going to finish writing out the string immediately to the screen. Otherwise, if we're done, we want to advance to the next screen. So else if dialog continue, and this will let us know if we are supposed to continue to more dialog, then dialog line plus equals 1, and then fetch equals true. Otherwise, so else instance destroy. Okay, so what that's going to do is if there is another line of dialogue in the system for us to look at, we are going to basically set fetch to true, which means everything's going to be cleared out. We're going to get the next line and start everything over. Otherwise, if we destroy the instance, it's going to destroy that dialog controller, which is going to remove the dialog box from the screen. Okay, so now to actually make sure that it's finishing writing stuff to the screen, I'm just going to throw some extra text in here just so I actually have a chance to hit the button. And we'll also put some more dialogue into here. Okay, so now if I run this, if I hit the key, any key, you can see it immediately finishes filling out those lines of text. Alright, that's looking pretty good right now. Okay, so next what I'm going to do is add in another line of dialogue here just to kind of illustrate something. If I want to, right now, start dialog is requesting line 0, which is that first line. But if I want to add in a third line here and request it, I'm going to need to put in my line here, and then I'm going to need to request line 2 since it starts counting at 0. But that's going to be really hard to remember. So we can see if we load this up, this works, and it's calling the correct line. But if you have 100 lines of dialogue in there, remembering what the number is for each line is going to be a real pain, especially if you go back and add in a line of dialogue or remove a line of dialogue. You're going to have to be doing a lot of counting and stuff. So let's fix this. We're going to go back into the add dialogue, and we're going to tell it to return dialogue line -1. So what that's going to do is that's going to take the dialogue line that it just wrote to and give it back to us. So now what we can do is we can set a variable equal to our functions. So let's go ahead and create a new one, D for dialogue, intro, text, and then we'll create another one down here and say D underscore second text. Now we're setting it equal to that add function script. So those variables are now going to automatically store the correct number we need. And it's going to be a lot easier to remember a variable name than it will be to remember a changing number. So we can now reference this with our variable name. So actually, let's just go ahead and cut this out of here. And then we're actually going to use this in a different place just to illustrate how you might actually call this in a real scenario. So let's go into the creation code for the room and paste it into there. And then we're just going to put in a comment to the top here, just to remind ourselves what we're doing. Okay, so now we're going to test to make sure the player object exists. So if instance exists, object player, and then if it does, we're going to start our dialog. We can't use self anymore, so we're going to have to use object player, because self would be referring to the room. And then since we're needing this variable in the object player, we need to use object player dot d second text. Okay, so now if we go back here, let's also add in a key press event. And let's just go with enter, I guess. Okay, so when someone presses the enter key, we're actually going to display another line of dialogue. So let's go ahead and paste this back in. And I guess we use second test in the other one. So let's use intro, our intro variable here. So we're going to go ahead and put that in here. And since this is still the player object, we can just leave self and stuff like that. So if we run that, we see when the room is created, we immediately get that line of text. And if we hit the enter key, we are presented with our other message. As a matter of fact, every time we hit the enter key, we're presented with that message. So that's essentially the basics of my dialogue system. There's more to it that can be added. This obviously doesn't cover how to do cutscene-like effects, so when a particular line of dialogue is triggered, tell a character to do something in response. If you take a look at some of my code that I'm using, you can kind of see how I put it. I've got all my variables assigned to the beginnings of different lines of dialogue. And part of the way that I decided to do it was that I store all of the dialogue that relates to a particular character in that character's object. So for instance, if we switch over to the cat, which is another character that follows you through the mines, and there's a lot of dialogue that revolves around him, I store all those lines in the cat. So that way when I do start dialogue, I reference either the player or the cat or whoever, and then what line should be triggered with that object's variable. One thing that I also do like about this particular system is that it makes it easy to create branching dialogue. So when my character runs into a room, depending on how many items he has or if he's made certain decisions prior, I can pull out different lines of dialogue that are appropriate to that situation. So I can say, well, if he has this item in his inventory, go to this line of dialogue. Otherwise, go to this line of dialogue. So it kind of allows me to create more complex storytelling capabilities. As you can also see in the game, there's things that also happen in response to dialogue. There are events that trigger. The cat runs away. The cat offers me a crystal. I take the crystal. Different things like they're happening. And if you're interested in learning how I went about adding that to my dialogue system, let me know in the comments below. And if that's something that's of interest to people, I can make a part 2 to this video series. But I've never tried anything like this before, so I have no idea if this is of any interest or not, but I figured I would at least try to get this first part up just so that some of the people that had asked about it could kind of see what I did. But I think that's all I have to show you for today, so thank you for watching. Hopefully it was useful to you, and I will see you guys next time.